Friends, this is Jeff. Lots of fun stuff coming up as we head into the summer. We have just 20 spots left for our June workshop. 60 of us are gathering in Colorado on June 27th and 28th, and we would love to have you. For our friends who can't make it, we will, at popular request, begin hosting our monthly online gatherings again sometime this summer. And as many of you know, our book will release at the end of June. All the links for all of this stuff are going to be at aroundthecircle.org. Sign up for a membership. You'll get all the updates. Friends, we're glad you're here, and may all good things be yours. I'm Jeff Cook.
And I'm TJ Wilson.
And this is Around the Circle.
I'm walking slowly, I'm taking my time. All I like talking is starting to rhyme. I'm letting go of lonely, letting go of strife. I just can't get enough of this beautiful life.
The Enneagram is a map of the human personality. It's a tool for navigating relationships. It creates language for what motivates us and helps us look at the way we look at everything else. Most importantly, the Enneagram's a mirror because sometimes you need help seeing yourself. My name is Jeff Cook. I'm a longtime professor of philosophy in Greeley, Colorado. TJ Wilson is out today, but I am joined with a guest. The great Hunter Mobley is with us. Hunter, this is your third time that you've been on the podcast with us, yeah?
Yeah, excited to be with you all again.
Hunter has a Juris Doctorate from the University of Kentucky, is a Master of Law from New York University. In recent years, he appears to be the right-hand man of Suzanne and Joe Stabile in their teaching work, and he has an excellent book that comes out in May 2025, and we're going to spend much of our time today unpacking how these accomplishments actually cover and hide the truest part of who Hunter actually is. Isn't that right?
Man, I love it. That's a good auspicious beginning. I'm ready.
My favorite question recently, because it brings out so much color in a lot of the conversations I'm having, is just to ask folks what their Enneagram story is. In the preface to your book, you tell quite a bit about, it's not the preface, it's the first couple chapters, about your story, about your spiritual journey. When you think about your Enneagram story, what comes to mind?
Well, my Enneagram story, I guess the first thing to mention is it starts perfectly for an Enneagram 2, which is my type. It started in friendship. So I'd never heard the word Enneagram. I didn't know what it was. I was familiar with some of the other personality inventories that we think about as companions next door to the Enneagram, Myers-Briggs and DISC and Berkman. But I was seated next to Suzanne and Joe Stabile at a dinner party in Florida, and I didn't know the language at the time to know what it meant to be a 2, but we were both 2s sitting next to each other at a friend's dinner party at a dining room table. And over dinner, we became friends. And so, my Enneagram journey begins in friendship. And I kind of smile at the way in which that just sort of was an early harbinger of what my Enneagram type and discovery was going to be. Is really, life is so much about relationships and making connection with people. And it's all through my Enneagram journey. Jeff, I was raised in the Southern Baptist church and then later migrated and found myself in the Pentecostal church setting and pastoring in a Pentecostal church. And because I'm a 2, I did it well. I did it the right way. I'm a 2 with a big 3 wing, and so I've got all the relationship stuff going on, and then, here we are. I'm ready to achieve with that 3 wing, and I think that's just kind of the water we swim in, and especially a lot of the water that we swim in the American South and in sort of the megachurch experiment of particularly the last century, sometimes what I call the evangelical industrial complex. And so I did it well. I was committed to it. It meant a lot to me. It was authentic to me in the season. And it was authentic to me because my spiritual journey, my Enneagram journey, my life journey was really based on making and keeping connection with the people that I had been in relationship with family, with friends, with community, with church. And the beautiful piece of the Enneagram journey for me is after I got beyond sort of just the typing of it and understanding what it means to be a 2 and what the personality of a 2 looks like, then you get behind the hood and you realize, okay, well, the The growth path for a 2 is really taking more of an inner journey to discover, who the heck am I apart from just my community fragments or my relationship family fragments that I've hooked into so well. And so that's what, when I got to that work, then I had to kind of confront some, well, gosh, is this really who I am? Is this really what I believe? Is this really what I want to do? And so what's been good and challenging and wonderful and hard about the Enneagram journey for me is my life today looks very different than it looked in terms of who I am, who I'm in relationship with, what my spiritual journey is, even what my work journey is, than it did when I started. And that's because of the Enneagram journey. It's because I kind of had to move through that pathway of, as a 2, detaching from who I needed to be, who I felt that I was expected to be, who I wanted to be, to then discover who am I really, and then to gain the courage and the insight and the wisdom and discernment to pursue that. So the Enneagram has just really been a tool of transformation for me, and that's what makes me excited to talk about it and to offer it. Jeff, probably like you, it's like I think of myself not as an evangelist for the Enneagram specifically. It's just the tool that I have the words for. But what I think of myself as is an evangelist for wisdom tools and transformational tools and encouraging people to not get stuck and to be curious and keep going. And that's what the Enneagram has done for me.
I would love to be mature enough to say I'm not an evangelist for the Enneagram, but you and I are going to land on a very similar platform when it comes to talking about the good life and the healthy life, and that is, core to your book is elevating the idea of virtue for the types. I think a huge misstep in our culture in general, and both of us come from a similar religious tradition, is focusing on the good life through a rule-based kind of lens, that good people do these 12 activities, perhaps, and they avoid these 12 activities. Yeah. And that's what the good life is. And this seems to me shallow. It seems to me misguided, and the elevation of virtue, and by virtue I would call this human excellences, or those character traits that routinely produce happiness, connection, and human thriving. This is a much better place to land when talking about what's your life about? What's the meaning of life? In your book, you talk about deconstructing your religious experience. Did you come to virtue prior or after that sort of experience?
Yeah, in some ways I came to virtue after, or kind of in the journey. In terms of the Enneagram, I think probably like a lot of people, when I first started doing work with the Enneagram, learning about my number, learning about the other numbers, you hear the language of passion over and over again. When you read the book, when you take the test, when you go to the Know Your Number workshop, one of the easier ways to begin describing each of the 9 personality types is to talk about the passion that they're built around. And that's appropriate. And I talk about passion when I do Know Your Number seminars as well. The passions really come to us through some of the foundation stones of the Enneagram, through the work of Evagrius Ponticus. It's sort of what roots the Enneagram and kind of some of the ancient traditions of the Desert Mothers and Fathers. And so we talk about passion. But what was really profound to me is one day, years into my Enneagram journey, I kind of realized, oh, you know what? There's this companion discipline called the virtues. Well, hold on, what's that? What's this about? What do those look like? And the interesting thing to me was, when I looked into the virtues, I discovered, okay, the virtue for each Enneagram type is actually the opposite of the passion for that same type. So some of them it's easier to see just based on the connotations for the words than others, but they're all opposites. So for me as a 2, I'm one of the easier numbers to see. My passion is pride, my virtue is humility. Well, if I just told a 2, your passion is pride and your virtue is the opposite of that, give me a word for that, we would assume, well, maybe humility. And when I first learned that, I thought, humility, what in the world does that mean? I don't know. Do I connect with that? And so I had to learn really what the Enneagram was inviting me to through humility. I had to learn what that meant. But once I learned about that, and I just stood back and said, okay, what does it mean if these two disciplines, the passions and the virtues, are opposites of one another? What does that mean fundamentally? And what I discovered was, okay, it's reminded me that if the virtue is connected to true self and the things of the soul, the eternal things, the essence things, and the passion is connected to the false self or the personality or the Enneagram number, then it's reminding me that at my core of the core of the core, I am the opposite of how I've come to be known through my Enneagram number. And at first that's kind of word salad, and it's sort of, you have to kind of sit with a minute and think about what in the world that means. But it means how I've come to know myself, which is typically through the language of personality and Enneagram number. That's how I would describe myself. If you said, tell me about your personality, tell me about you, Hunter, we would all kind of use, a lot of times initially, the language of personality. Well, I like to meet people, I'm interested in relationships, I love to connect, all the things. But the storyline behind the story that is revealed through the work of the passions and virtues is, well, wait, maybe that's actually the exact opposite, the paradox, the 180-degree turn from who I really am. And that's something to really explore and to unwrap. And so that's really what the book is focused on, is telling us you're the opposite of who you think you are. You are virtue, you are not passion. Now, again, there's no moral inventory behind that. It doesn't mean passion is bad. Passion and personality and Enneagram number, all those things help us. They help us get through the days, but they're not the truest things about us. There is something deeper than passion, and the Enneagram reveals it to us through the word of virtue. And that's what we're returning to. That's what we're invited to rediscover. And frankly, Jeff, that's what, just to kind of connect to the earlier thing you said about, 12-step Christianity or five, I talk in the book about kind of rejecting, I had to unlearn this idea of 5-step Christianity. This idea that, okay, there's steps, I'm going to take the hill, I'm going to climb the mountain, I'm going to do big things for God, I'm going to figure it out, it's going to be hard. All the language of so much of us, especially those of us that came up through maybe more evangelical communities, or even though we talked about grace, it was kind of a, work your way to the good life sort of mentality. It just, all that does is build ego, it builds personality, it builds number. And so if we're going to return to virtue, which is not something outside of ourselves, it's something that's truer, that's inside of us, that was always there, that we're invited to rediscover, then we need a different methodology. And that's why I introduce, for my journey, the language of contemplation. It was a different posture, a different methodology, something different than sort of the take the hill, 5-step, where's the next book, where's the next guru Christianity. And I needed another framework to lead me back inside to something deeper, rather than the framework that traditionally had led me to think, what do I need to be that's outside of myself?
2 quick definitions just for the sake of the conversation. One, we are going to be using the word passion throughout. For some in their tradition, they line these with the 7 deadly sins or 9 sins for the Enneagram. And so just as a footnote. Second, I would love to ask you about personality on this front, as in terms of a definition. When talking about yourself as a 2, and when seeking to elevate your true self, is your true self exhibited, described best with 2-ness, or is 2-ness in your mind something that's added on? It's a constructed personality, as it were, is what I was hearing there.
Yeah, both. And let me kind of make sense of what I mean. 2-ness from the way that I traditionally understood it before really incorporating a lot of the work around the virtues, the work that I didn't know now. It meant the language of personality. It meant pride. It meant trying to help everybody. It meant trying to save and fix and rescue. And that iteration of what it means to be a 2 is about personality, and it's not about true self. In fact, it's the opposite of true self. However, once you lead the virtues and some of the true self elements of what it means to be a 2 back into the understanding of the bigness of 2-ness, then it's all part of the equation again. So to be a 2, to me now, doesn't just mean to have the passion of pride, it means also to have the virtue of humility. Well, the virtue of humility is connected to the truest thing. It's the God image that I bear out in my soul. And so that's where now two-ness means something more to me. It means something bigger to me. It means something that can be connected to the language of the soul. Whereas initially in my Enneagram journey, I think for a lot of us in our Enneagram journey, we just think of it as really a language of the personality mask that we wear to cover and protect the virtue.
This is another place that you and I are going to agree strongly. I much prefer, I suppose, and this is just a preference coming into the material, to start with, you have been made wonderfully, gloriously. Like you're like the value of a human soul is, immeasurable. Mm-hmm. And starting there, I think a much better place for all sorts of reasons.
I do too.
Than starting with, by the way, you're trash, or by the way, you're evolved scum, as it were. There is something I think really helpful for stability and self-understanding.
I do too.
Saying, what is there to be discovered then?
Well, and that's what I think is, I agree, I'm so excited about with this way of thinking about the Enneagram. Is what I'm talking to people about is it's a journey of rediscovering what was always fundamentally there and what's actually truer than personality. And so if we needed to go fix ourselves or find something that wasn't already inside, it'd be a whole different journey that we'd have to take. But what the Enneagram reveals is exactly what you're saying, Jeff. The story started in virtue, but virtue was so precious and true and vulnerable about each one of us that in the school of hard knocks that we joined, from about day one of life, we learned that we needed to protect it. And what's one of the interesting, scary, fundamental things about being human is we learn to protect things most with their opposite. When I don't want you to know something about me that's fundamentally true, in many ways I'll project to you maybe the opposite of that thing that I know to be true because I think that's going to keep you off the scent. Well, we do the same thing with protecting those virtues with their opposite, but we do it so well and so early and so long that we forget too. We forget there's something under the personality. We forget there's something that's deeper and more original. And so we actually forget about the virtue. And so that's why we mean it when we say, well, I'm a 2 and this is what that means. It means I like to help people. It means I'm not as interested in my needs as I'm interested in your needs. I don't think, what's going on with me is as important maybe as what's going on with you. And we mean that in the moment. Not because we're trying to hide or we're trying to pretend, but because we've actually lost touch with the matters of the soul and the true self. That's what the Enneagram invites us into. It's inviting us into a rediscovery, not a search or a quest for something new or outside of ourselves, but more of a returning to something that was always there and is truer. We've just lost touch with it.
It's good. Philosopher that I am, I have to start with the philosophy. We'll get into meat here in a second. You're giving me a bridge to some of my friends who love more of the soul child way of coming to Enneagram, or want to talk a lot about childhood wounds. And what I'm hearing in your language is perhaps like you can talk about your original self, and you can talk about the creation of your personality, or perhaps the unveiling of your personality in these places you felt wounded as a young person. There are some folks who want to say your Enneagram type originates through wounding that you experienced as a young person, and that just never sits well with me. But as you're talking, what I'm hearing is, well, it may be the case that this is unveiling some of your coping, some of the layers of personality that became, strategy is a better word there, for addressing those sorts of pains. You got, I suppose, final thoughts on that before we jump in?
I agree with you. I think that our Enneagram type that's most particularly expressed through our number and the language of personality, is really a set of adaptations and strategies and projections that we develop and we pick up in a quest to protect the immortal diamond, as Father Rohr says, inside.
Mm-hmm. That's a good word. One of the things that I loved about your book is it felt like it was, I'm very aware of how much my oneness is coloring how I'm thinking about and teaching Enneagram. And when I read your book, I was like, this is a very two-ish way of presenting the material, which can be incredibly helpful. And being able to see Enneagram through different lenses, I also think incredibly helpful, because it's not necessarily the lens that I necessarily come to. What I saw, especially in the first couple of chapters, was that you're an earner by nature as a 2, and that part of your engagement with Enneagram and seeing it as a tool for pushing you towards health, the value that it brought, ended up shutting down that side, or inviting you to say, you don't have to earn in order to be a flourishing human being. Am I wrong there?
No, I mean, that's my great lifetime of work. That's my great unlearning. And I really think that's the language of my returning. Yes, in my 2-ness, I am constantly making deposits into other people, because I believe that if I make enough deposits, then whenever the withdrawal comes, I won't be overspent. I mean, that's the most fundamental way that I can describe maybe what it feels like to be a 2. It's taking me, and will continue to take me, my whole lifetime to unlearn that set of adaptations and projections, and to, as you're describing, find my own place of self-worth and place in the world and place in relationship that can stand beyond deposits and stand beyond earning. And that's what fundamentally that is it's really a reconnection with the virtue of humility. And that's the work that I think is happening, but it's unfinished.
Is there a word? So when I was reading, I really wanted to ask you this one question. Like, I connect with that, and I'm challenged by that, because I too am an earner as a 1. And I'm curious if that same message is there for the 4, the 5, and the 9, who may have the opposite kind of predisposition toward the world and toward getting what they want, that is more reserved, more solitary, more drawn. I was curious if you had wisdom on that front.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you're right to, in some of the conversation that we're having right now, the stance work is probably the most relevant in breaking up numbers and how we're describing things now. I do think 1s and 2s and 6s, because we are dependent stance numbers, are all making decisions and orienting our activity and our action really around the expectations, the feelings, the inputs, the affirmations or lack thereof of other people. And so in a way, 1s and 2s and 6s at the fundamental level are sort of earners in different ways. It comes across differently for each of those 3 numbers, but that's what it means in many ways to be a dependent number. But I think you're right. I think that 4s and 5s and 9s being withdrawing numbers, and 3s and 7s and 8s being aggressive numbers, that their journey looks different. So what they're invited to unlearn is different. For 4s and 5s and 9s, because they are so interior focused, in some ways what they're invited to unlearn is that you can't just go inside and hide forever from yourself, because they're also going inside and hiding from themselves too. It's just, I'm kind of going outside of myself to hide from myself. 4s and 5s and 9s in many ways are sort of going deeper in. And the challenge for that is it can seem to 4s, 5s, and 9s. This is why we have to talk even in the language of contemplative spirituality. 4s and 5s and 9s sometimes think, hey, I got this. I'm there. I was born a contemplative. And that's because when you talk about some of the disciplines of contemplative spirituality, about turning in and looking for the interior castle and silence and stillness and solitude, they think they get A+ and all that. And the question is, when I talk to 9s, okay, great, 9s, you're good at centering prayer. Are you doing centering prayer with intention, or have you just fallen asleep? So 4s and 5s and 9s have a whole different invitation in front of them. And in some ways, some of them have harder work to do than the rest of us, because the rest of us kind of get that, our souls and our interior lives are underdeveloped. 1s and 2s and 6s and 3s and 7s and 8s can kind of own that once we finally find the language or find the way to kind of see this is what we need. We need to sort of go inside, and we need to find the inner light and the immortal diamond. But 4s and 5s and 9s in some ways almost have harder work, because they sort of think that they've got it already. And they've got just as much work to do as the rest of us, but it's a different kind of work.
Right. I would love your thoughts on the inward journey for 2s in particular, because I think this is one of the things that I'm learning about 2s. There seems to me so much energy that's out front and gifted, and yet there's a chunk that's held back. And sometimes the 2 doesn't even realize that they have held something back, or even understand what that thing is, as it were, behind the glass, as it were. And I'm curious what that feels like for you. I'm so introspective in my type, and so it feels to me somewhat of the opposite of like suddenly understanding that you have a self and you have a relationship to yourself, and you need to understand yourself in this inward way. Could you speak to that?
It's hard for 2s. I think what surprises people sometimes who aren't 2s is when you ask me as a 2 just simple questions that invite inner process. How do you feel today? Well, how are you doing? How's life going for you? How's your soul? Any of those questions. When I redirect or pivot or kind of defer an answer to that, it's not because I'm just trying to project some kind of over interest in you, or, my 2ness makes me want you to feel special and let's not focus on me. It's because I honestly don't have an answer to that question. I would need to sit here for a minute and bring up thinking and do some actual inner processing to give you a true, authentic answer to that question. So my redirect or my deferral of being known or being in some ways transparent with you it's reflective of a unknownness by myself. That's the challenge for 2s in that inner journey and work, is we have gotten so far from an inner knowing of self and a commitment to really looking deep within and discovering and naming and processing and owning what's there, that it's hard for us to find our way back to it. It's very hard. I kind of know I'm doing the worst in my personality when I've had an interaction with somebody. I've had coffee with somebody, I've had lunch with somebody, and what they say is, gosh, Hunter, this was so nice. I love being with you. And, next time we're together, let's talk about you, because today all we did is talk about me. And even though that sounds, nice in one sense, like, oh, wow, that tells me that I really helped them feel like this time was about them. If I'm listening with the ears of the heart, what I can hear is they're telling me, Hunter, this relationship is not mutual or reciprocal. I want to know you. Yes, I'm grateful for you. Yes, I maybe have enjoyed this time with you, but I don't know you. And that's what I've got to learn to hear. And that's what I've got to learn to find. But I've got to find it for myself before I can even name it to someone else.
Right. That's where I suppose in some of my conversations with 2s, it goes that way, that when the 2 begins to speak about themselves, it all of a sudden is a little bit more awkward than the conversation we were having before, for this reason. Yeah. It's that I do know what it's like to be thinking repressed, and I assume that's what, as I'm hearing you talk, that's what's going on, is there's a thinking repression about my inner life. Mm-hmm. And just getting the vocabulary around that can be constantly tricky.
It's really
tricky. Just not like a one-off thing. Like, oh, I did the work. I found out who I was. Now I have good answers.
And because it's kind of unexplored, Jeff, when you catch me in real time and we're talking about myself, yes, or you're asking me how I'm doing, what's happening is I'm verbally processing something for the first time in the moment. I haven't worked this out internally yet. And so it can be awkward sometimes, because then once I hear myself say it, I kind of am also judging whether that's really true. And so sometimes, well, hold on. No, let me back up. So you're getting a verbal processing real-time experience.
I feel like I relate to that a lot, especially when doing like therapy or doing podcasts, and I say stuff about myself, and then I go through that and I go back and listen to it and edit out all the things like, well, that's not true, and that didn't work, and I didn't express myself correctly. Is my problem. It's good. Last question as we jump into the virtues. There's going to be a lot of talk of spiritual practice, of the spiritual life. When you think of that concept, how does that overlap with Enneagram, heart, mind, body? Do you have a picture in your mind of how those overlap?
Well, when I talk about spiritual practices and particularly contemplative spiritual practices, which is what is talked about a lot in this book, there are sort of some Enneagram overlaps based on our Enneagram number, maybe based on what triad we're in, like you're describing with head, heart, gut, or maybe even based on a stance position. There are some of these practices that are more natural to us, and then there's some that are more challenging for us or less intuitive. And I really think both of those categories have something to offer. For me as a 2, I'm a feeler. Life comes at me through the heart center first before it's processed through the body or the mind. And so there's something for me in spiritual practices that are really heart originating or heart oriented. There's something great there for me. There's also something great there for me in the spiritual practices that are less connected to flowing through matters of the heart. And so I need both. And so I think what I introduce in the book and in my teaching is we need spiritual work and spiritual practices that are both more intuitive for us and less intuitive for us. There's something for us in both of those categories. And so I think we notice in our Enneagram number what sort of are places of, maybe to use an Ignatian term, places of consolation in spiritual practices, and we notice sort of places in spiritual work that feel kind of like desolation. This is hard. This isn't something that I want to do. This is not something that comes naturally to me. And my invitation to myself and to all the rest of us is a diet of both, a balance.
To go one step below that is, when speaking of spiritual practices, what is it that it makes something spiritual as opposed to some just normal practice?
An intention. Honestly, I believe that the only thing that separates, for example, centering prayer or contemplative prayer from meditation is simply an intention. The work that you do is the same, the philosophy is the same, but to me, what makes a practice a spiritual practice is that it is accompanied by an intention to be totally open to the presence and activity of God, most of which is unseen. And so that's where all of a sudden, with intention, working a jigsaw puzzle to me can be a spiritual practice. With intention, taking a walk can be a spiritual practice. Without intention, walking a labyrinth can just be a walk. And so what to me brings a practice into the realm of spiritual or contemplative posture is really an intention to be totally open to the presence and activity of God, most of which will be unseen.
That's a good definition. That's very helpful. Love to talk about the combinations. As I was going through, the middle chunk of the book focuses again on the virtues and the passions in combination. And I just wanted to start with a picture of the virtues, and perhaps because, as you were kind of saying, we are so familiar with the 7 deadly sins and this list, and especially if we've done Enneagram work, oftentimes people bring up our worst self to showcase how the Enneagram can be used and the rest. But simply naming the virtues and giving your take on them, I think, would be very helpful. And I wanted to start with 9s, because especially given how much your book set up focuses on subtraction. 9 is going to, I think, expose what's actually taking place because the virtue is action, yeah? Mm-hmm. That feels like an addition, but perhaps not, yeah?
Yeah, action as the virtue for 9s, it's tricky because 9s can think, okay, well, I just need to get busy. I just need to get moving. I just need to do something. And that's going to put me in a place of virtue. No, actually, sloth can be extreme busyness. Sloth does not necessarily mean about retiring to the couch and turning off. Sloth can be about being so busy that it gives you permission to not get to the things that you know that you need to do. And so action as a virtue for 9s, it may be about the 4 to 5 things in a lifetime that only you can and must do and get to. And that if you do not get to them, you will know that you have missed something that was yours. And maybe that's 4 to 5 things. So it's not just about busyness or activity. It's really, that's why sometimes we use the additive word right action, not just action 9s. We don't want you to just get moving, just get busy, just get active. We want you to discern what right action is for you, and actually ask yourself if all of your activity and all of your busy doing has been your permission and procrastination from getting to the thing that will be right action for you that may be hard or cause conflict.
Love that. I would want to affirm all that. I want to bring up a quote earlier just to get a sense of, I want to understand how you're coming to spiritual practice. Earlier in Setting Up Virtue, you said, let's free ourselves from the belief. It tells us if any good is going to happen in our lives, that it is going to be the result of our actions. And you see where I'm going there in terms of like, if I'm coming to the material and saying I need to subtract, and yet there is something, it seems to me, that I'm supposed to enter in terms of the virtues that are there to be had. How do you wrestle with that?
Yeah, well, here's what I think. All of our subtraction is really about subtracting passion and subtracting personality so that virtue can be rediscovered and revealed. So it's not that, because see, the virtue is not something that we need to add, it's something that we need to uncover. So I invite people to a spirituality of subtraction in a way, as a way of revealing to us that this work is an inner work, not an outer work. Again, you don't need to go get the virtue. You don't need to go find the virtue. You need to, or you're invited to, unleash the personality, let go of the personality a little bit, hold it more loosely so that the thing that was always there can be re-revealed. So that's the message, not just for 9s, but really for all of us. We all need subtraction in a way. 9s need it, every number needs it. And if we will subtract in kind of the biggest picture way that word means, then I believe that what we will find is remaining are the virtues.
Right.
And the thing, Jeff, that is exciting to me is our virtue for our number, humility for 2s, action for 9s, innocence for 8s, all the virtues. That virtue is just what I describe as maybe our feature or our core virtue. It's all it is it's a gate or an entry point or a doorway into the room of virtue. Once we get into the room of virtue, all the 9 are there. It's the same with the passion. If I'm really doing bad today, if I'm kind of wallowing around in my personality, it's not just pride that I'll find. I'll find all of them. I'll find anger, I'll find lust, I'll find envy, I'll find greed, all of the passions. Because pride, as my passion for 2s, is kind of an entry point that sort of leads me into the room of passion. Well, humility is an entry point that leads me into a room of virtue. And that's why, sometimes when you meet wisdom people who have been doing wisdom work for a long time and are mature and seasoned, they discover, and you discover about them, that really they can connect with language that feels more universal that's less personal about I'm this type, I'm this way of being, I'm this passion, I'm this virtue. They discover that they are connected to all the virtues.
Yep.
And I think that's a sign of growth. And it's a sign of maturity for all of us. And that's why sometimes, when you do Enneagram work with people, when you're catching them at a later point in the wisdom journey and, they're just then learning their Enneagram type, sometimes it can be a little bit harder for them actually to name their type because they've evolved a little bit to a place where they just hold all the things of personality looser. Mm-hmm. And that's why you say sometimes, okay, go back to an earlier season of life when you had less tools and when you were less evolved, and think about which of these numbers really speaks to that season.
Yep. As you're talking there, so there's been a wave recently of, I think rightly on one front, disparaging the idea of wings when talking about Enneagram. The one place I feel like I see wings very prominent in my life and actually really worth giving attention to is around the topics that you're bringing up. I feel like the passions of the wings, the sins of the wings, and the virtues of the wings, as well as the stress and security move, that when I look at the list, those are the ones that pop.
Yeah.
As a 1, I'm not really connected to 6. Like I can see the passion there and I can see the virtue there. Mm-hmm. It's not really the thing that hits me, but I absolutely can feel the pride and humility on my 2 side. And I can also feel that where sloth comes into my life on the 9 side. And I don't know if you have that experience as well, but I wanted to float that.
No, I give a hearty amen to that, Jeff. I think too little attention has been given to the wings. And I fundamentally believe the Enneagram is a labyrinth. It's like this beautiful tool that leads us where we need to go when we need to go there. And oftentimes it leads us on journeys that we're not totally aware of at that moment, for good and for bad. So like you said, sometimes the numbers on either side of us are the numbers that we're connected to through those stress and security movements. Those are just places that the Enneagram hooks us into or leans us toward, sometimes toward the passion side of those numbers, sometimes toward the virtue side of those numbers. And what I think is actually pretty interesting and compelling about the wings is there's very little in the Enneagram that is not inviting us toward becoming more balanced. So head, heart, gut. Well, we're invited to become balanced. Thinking, feeling, doing. We're invited toward balance. Orientation to time, past, present, future. We're invited toward balance. Even when we get to the subtypes, sexual, social, self-preserving, we're invited toward balance. So the question would be, well, why wouldn't something about the discipline of the wings be inviting us toward a little bit more balance in some way as well? And I think actually there's something there. It's been less talked about and less explored, but I think it's a place where the Enneagram is going to move and go to, and there's some new things for us to learn about the wings. So I agree. I don't ever want to kind of shut down the wings as unimportant. I actually think, 1, they're an invitation to balance. 2, like you're describing, they're an invitation to see how the Enneagram in a labyrinthine way leads us where we need to go when we need to go there.
Hilariously, off mic, I set up our conversation, dear listener, by saying, so I have all these disagreements with your book, and I'm sorry if I come across as confrontational. Everything we've done has been, yes, you're entirely correct on this front.
We're tracking.
Amen. So, delightful thing. He's Hunter Mobley. His book, Letting Go, Finding You, Uncover Your Truest Self Through the Enneagram and Contemplation, is coming out May 2025. My friend, I'm cheering for you. I'm cheering for your success. I'm cheering that this gets in the right hands. So
thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the gift of being on your podcast.
Yeah, always a delight to catch up. So much love to you and family. And if folks are looking for your other work aside from the book, which you can find on Amazon and other places fine books are sold, where else can people find
Enneagram you? Hunter. That's the website. That's social handles. So Enneagram Hunter is where you can find me and find what I'm up to and where I'll be. And Also, you can find some of the work that I do on Life in the Trinity Ministries website and their work as I lead the Contemplative Cohort for them each year.
Bang. Those cohorts, if somebody wants to get involved, they go to that website.
Absolutely.
You all do like there's like 40 people that
There is. We take 40 people through a whole year together of doing this work of really diving into contemplative spiritual practice and Enneagram wisdom together. It's kind of a laboratory and a long, year-long retreat that we do together. So you can find information about that on LTM's website. And I'd say if this work inspires you, come join us, because there's nothing like doing it in person together with a group. It's really a gift.
Excellent. I will put all the links to that in the show notes if you're interested, friends. He's Hunter Mobley. Again, just a delight talking to you. And I'm Jeff Cook, and who you aren't just isn't interesting.